Someday. I am Rabbi Joshua Rose, and you are Congregation Sharing Torah. Welcome. This is Rabbi Emanuel Rose, who I venture to guess that most of you know. And we are going to have a conversation today about our individual Jewish trajectories and how they relate to one another, and how we're distinct from one another. And we'll each talk a little bit about our own individual path as Jews and rabbis, and we'll reflect on the differences and the commonalities in our rabbinate and our approach to Judaism. And we want to take a lot of time for questions and answers, because that seems like the interesting part. So first, I want to welcome a couple of people. I want to welcome and acknowledge my my mom, Rose, and always thrilled to have her here, and my auntie, her twin sister, Angela, and my sister, Melanie. And I also want to acknowledge Rabbi Stamfer, who we're so honored to have. It's a lovely surprise. We didn't know that you were going to be here. We're honored to have another one of Portland's great rabbis, in addition to me, here with us. So it's really an honor. Thank you so much for being here. We're proud to have you in our building. So I thought I would start by inviting my father, my Abba, to talk a little bit about his own journey. But first, I want to just give a sense for people who might not know, and I suspect that the folks who don't know are people who are a little bit younger and who didn't grow up in Oregon. I'm not going to give my father's biography, but I'll just, I think that to understand and have context for our discussion today, you should have a sense of my dad's rabbinate. So my father, you can talk more about this in detail, but my father, before he was retired and Rabbi Emeritus at Beth Israel, was really very prominent in the life of the city and in the life of the state. Obviously within the Jewish community, but well beyond the Jewish community. And that because he was outspoken on a number of, really on every issue of public import in the public discourse. And it was also during a different time when there were 3 rabbis in Portland. And there were 3 fantastic rabbis, Rabbi Stamfer, Rabbi Rose, and Rabbi Geller, bless her memory. And so that was at a time when if a rabbi said something, people listened, like the E.F. Hutton ads. Now there's, what do we have, 18 rabbis, 20 rabbis in the city. So every time you turn around, there's another rabbi making a pronouncement about something. And so it's a little, there's a little more noise in the Jewish, on the Jewish frequency. But these 3 gentlemen really had an important role, that whether they wanted it to or not, being the voice of the Jewish people within the city of Portland and the state of Oregon fell on their shoulders. And my Abba, I think, because of his sense of what Judaism was, I think accepted that responsibility and lived up to it and did his best to really put forth a righteous Jewish voice into the public discourse of the city and the nation and also the state of Oregon. And so, it happens all the time. I'll be walking around and somebody will say, "Hey, are you Josh Rose?" And I'm starting to feel all like, "Oh yeah, this is someone who's heard my podcast." Or maybe they came to one of my sermons and they're like, "Your dad is so amazing." But really, it happens every week, at least once a week, where someone tells me your dad bar mitzvahed me, or your father. And these are not necessarily Jewish people who will say to me, your father had such a huge influence on me and really shaped how I thought about this or that thing in public life. So the other thing I want to say is that just knowing my dad, I want to invite you to not necessarily feel the obligation to answer in kind. You don't have to tell everybody how great I am, which loves to do, as does my mother. But I was giving you that runway of introduction just because some folks in the room might not know the prominent place that you had in not just the Portland Jewish community, but really in Oregon's, in the life of the state of Oregon for the last couple of decades. So you can resist the temptation to tell everyone how fabulous I am. So with that, I want to just really start things off along the lines that you and I had discussed, which is inviting you to talk about your own trajectory, your upbringing, and then I'll do the same, and we'll go from there.
Okay. First of all, I'm thrilled to be here. I really am. To be here with my son. By the way, how are we going to refer to one another?
Just as we normally would.
Okay, we'll try. It's really an honor to be here, and I'll say one word about my son.
I told you.
Just one sentence. Just one sentence. I really truly believe that you have one of the great rabbis. This is not his various talents are clear to everybody here. His warmth, which you all experience, I know with him. His speaking abilities. One of the things you probably get a taste of is his Jewish scholarship. I cannot tell you how proud I am of what he has done in terms of Jewish study, Hebraic studies, throughout these first years of his rabbinate. We're just very, very proud of him, not only as his son, but as a rabbi.
Thank you.
The next thing I want to say is very important. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Now, I have a connection to St. Patrick's Day, I want you to know, because when I was a teenager, I think unbeknownst to my father, Rabbi Rose, my mother somehow allowed me to march in the St. Patrick's Day parade down Fifth Avenue.
Perfect role.
I mean, it's unbelievable. I was in the American Nautical Cadets, which was a parallel to the Boy Scouts. And, you know, we marched down Fifth Avenue. It was quite an experience. But we're going to go from there back many, many years. One of the most powerful memories in my life was when my grandfather, Rabbi Joshua Rose, died. And he was the rabbi of a shul in Lower East Side, New York. And we used to visit him every Sunday afternoon. We drove in from Jamaica, Long Island to visit my grandfather. And I remember every time I walked into his house, he'd be sitting around with some of his talmidim, some of his students, teaching, studying, and I'd go right over to his desk and he gave me this wet kiss on the cheek. Grandpa Judah Rose. So, I remember his funeral. I was quite young, and I saw something that I had never seen again, never, I'm sure will ever see again. They carried my grandfather through the streets of Lower New York City, from his home to his synagogue, where the funeral service took place. It was an amazing, amazing experience. I mean, you know, just by my remembering and recalling it, I do. And one of the other lovely things about my grandpa was, perhaps Joshua will allude to it, several years ago, while he was still a student at Hebrew Union College in New York City, he sought out my grandfather's synagogue. I mean, I want you to tell us why. I never told me why, but he sought out my grandfather's synagogue, and something I had never done. And he arranged for us to go down to the synagogue a couple of different times, and I remember some of the leaders of the synagogue were there expressing how proud they were to have us visiting that synagogue. I'm sure Joshua remembers that he went down to Ellis Island and looked up the whole history of the family coming over to the country in the early 1900s. And the other last thing I want to comment about that is that, as some of you may know, Joshua just returned from a meeting of scholars in New York City. And I know he went past my grandfather's shul, which is one of the two synagogues still thriving in the Lower East Side of New York. And I'm taking this opportunity to ask him why, sometime this afternoon, to explain why he went by there. Jumping after that's an intense memory. I was raised in Jamaica, Long Island. My father was a rabbi. He had 3 different ordination degrees, which meant that he was recognized to be a scholar in 3 different areas of Jewish law. But he also loved Jewish music, absolutely loved synagogue music. And therefore, his first part of his career was as a cantor. And in fact, he became the organizer, along with another well-known cantor in New York City, cantor David Putterman. I'm sure Rabbi Stanford will be familiar with some of my references to this. And my father and Cantor Putterman really represented, I think, sort of the beginning of the organization for respect for cantors in a way that had never happened before.
Were they founded the American Conference of Cantors, or?
Yeah, my father was the first president of the Cantors Assembly, which is the conservative cantorial organization. And then he's kept to that career for 25 years. And then he became the rabbi of the congregation very near Chicago, where he was rabbi for another 25 years. And he kept on being a rabbi for many more years after that, including a stay in Florida for a while, where he and my mother died, both of them. And so that's, a broad sweep of the kind of family background that I had. I had a brother who was a rabbi.
Sorry, we talk about David. Just so people know, we're talking your father was an Orthodox rabbi.
Yes.
Right? Just so people have an understanding.
Correct, he was. And then, to take you back to my childhood, I was raised, of course, in my father's synagogue in New York, but the synagogue that I was raised in was also sort of a Jewish community center. The name of the congregation was Jewish Community Center, actually. And I remember everything about my growing up there and learning basic Hebrew and learning enough Hebrew to become a student in the Marshall E. Hebrew High School, which was made up of actually the best Hebrew students in the city of New York. And that became a very, very important part of my life as time went on in terms of youth group work that I got involved in the conservative movement, because that's what Jamaica Jewish Center was. And you think of the congregation here as a nice, lovely synagogue and a social hall downstairs. And but I have to tell you, I became an expert bowler when I was a teenager. And I had a 187-point average. That's pretty good, right? But the bowling alley was in the Jamaica Jewish Center. And that's why I became such an expert. I mean, I had a gym, a swimming pool, everything was there. So it was a center of Jewish life in many different ways. And then after that, of course, I went to university in Cincinnati. My brother was already in Cincinnati because he was going to go to rabbinic school after he finished the university. So I joined him in that process, going to the University of Cincinnati first, and then entering through Union College, which was a 5-year program of study.
Well, let me just, because folks don't necessarily know, so just to paint the picture, so his father's an Orthodox rabbi, and his brother David, who was older than David of blessed memory, who was older than him, went to Hebrew Union College, which is the Reformed Jewish seminary. So, there was already a generational shift there, and so my dad is saying he followed him there to the Reformed seminary.
Yes, and it was very interesting in terms of, well, why don't I stop and you talk a little bit?
No, I want to hear, what I was interested in hearing, as you and I have talked about many, many times, is how did you think through that, and what was it like for your family and for David and for you and your father, the son of an Orthodox rabbi who heads to the Reformed seminary? So just talk a little bit about that and why that happened. Why were you on that track?
It's really very interesting. My father was a scholar not only of Jewish works, but he also was introduced to the thinking of early Reform Judaism. You have to remember that Jews could not be citizens of any country until the 19th century. That's a shocker. Till the 19th century. And that was because of all the ugly history that we know about. But it became a challenge as far as my father was concerned, because he had his feet in both worlds. He had his feet in the Orthodox world, in the conservative movement where he lived, and also he was very much aware of modern movements in Jewish life. And he essentially was responsible for David and my going to Hebrew Union College. It was very interesting. And I'm not I've never been absolutely certain as to why he moved us in that direction. But as I said, he was became a scholar of advanced Jewish studies, which meant that in Germany, for example, there was the emergence of the Reform Jewish movement, and there were wonderful scholarly works written in Germany, and that's where the movement started. And he had great respect for it. And I think he also, to be perfectly blunt with you, he had some, because of his experiences, he not only had some experiences of the negativity that was abounded about cantors, and how rabbis looked down, many rabbis looked down upon cantors, believe it or not, despite some of the great voices. But also, there were a lot of congregations who treated rabbis shabbily and without respect. And that was also extant. It wasn't that it happened in one shul, but it happened in many places.
So it's interesting because you're saying that your moving to in the Reform movement was not you making a personal break in terms of thinking through what felt right to you and didn't, but that rather than your father guiding you down this path.
Yes, absolutely he did. There's no question about it. And which always meant a great deal to me, because he respected the work we were doing and the approach that we had, even though it wasn't his approach to live a Jewish life. So I guess I'll stop here and ask you to do the same.
Okay.
Not to stop.
Right. Yeah. Right. There's a lot of years. It's not like your career, ended when you started rabbinical school. So we should circle back to that. But I'll just say that. So I grew up here in Portland, and my whole picture of Judaism obviously came from the beautiful, magnificent shul down the street, Beth Israel, and seeing my father up on the bima, and that always made me very, very proud. And I think my sisters and I took an enormous amount of pride in the fact that our father was the rabbi and was quite prominent.
And why did you laugh during the confirmation service when you were giving a speech?
Probably because my sister, I would imagine, I don't remember, but I would imagine one of my sisters was probably catching my eye and making me laugh. So very, very, very proud. And as I said, my father was really prominent, and so that was a source of pride for a kid. And that was, Reform Judaism was my picture of what Judaism was. And so it's interesting because in some ways our stories are similar, because we each went on a different trajectory in our own Jewish lives. But for me, it didn't begin with rabbinical school. In your case, by the time you went to rabbinical school, you were already on a different track than your father. But I did go to HUC. I went to Hebrew Union College in New York, as my father said. HUC has 4 campuses: Jerusalem, New York, Cincinnati, and Los Angeles.